coming in has slowed a little bit, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm sure in true Venture Cafe style, people will continue to come in. The one thing about virtual is the door is a little quieter than it is in the main room there in Havana. So welcome everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to I-10 Second Thursday at Venture Cafe. My name is Melissa Grizzle, and I'm the Director of Entrepreneur Development at I-10. We are a not-for-profit that's been around since 2008 and worked with tech startups here in the St. Louis region, and have been partnering with Venture Cafe since they opened their doors to do our Second Thursday programming here. So monthly we bring topics that we think are important to entrepreneurs and other people in the innovation community. And that can often be very typical things like sales strategies and content marketing best practices and mentor best practices and the things that you would definitely think about wanting to know more about as you're growing a company. But one area we also think is extremely important and probably doesn't get the attention that it deserves is the self-care that is critical for founders and entrepreneurs as they are growing their companies. We know the life of an entrepreneur is an extreme roller coaster. Lots of ups and downs and lots of hats to be worn and always something else to do. And carving out time and understanding why self-care is important and how it affects people as individuals and therefore the sustainability and success of their company is an important thing. So we brought our friends from CMA here, some fabulous organizational psychologists that will share with us some strategies for managing through stress and uncertainty and taking care of ourselves. And I'm sure back it up with a little bit of research and some data for those of us that want to say, well, why does that really matter? So I will let, so I'd like to introduce Rob Patterson and Kelli Huber from CMA. I'll let them tell you a little bit more about them and about CMA and turn the floor over to them. Rob and Kelli?
Perfect. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Rob. And my colleague, Kelli Huber, here as well.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
And we're from CMA, as Melissa mentioned. And we are both organizational psychologists. So we have our PhDs in organizational psychology. I received mine from St. Louis University here locally, and have been working here at CMA for about 5.5-ish years or so. And really what we do at a high level is talk and partner with organizations to help them address some of those issues that, as Melissa mentioned, are usually a bit less top of mind. And that really gets at anything on the people side of the equation. So we help organizations identify talent. We help organizations develop talent. We help organizations develop leaders and make sure that they have the right people on the bus to make the organization go where it needs to go. Oftentimes, as part of our work with organizations, we are asked to talk about different areas that are important on the people side. As you can imagine, lately, conversations around stress and stress management have been very popular, as many of us are experiencing different stressors that are not the normal stressors we tend to experience both at work and outside of it. Kelli, anything you would add about who we are as an organization?
No, that really captures it. Just a little bit more about me. I also completed my degrees locally at SLU and then my PhD at UMSL, and I have also been with CMA for 6 years now. And my research interests fall heavily here within this realm of stress and well-being. So I'm excited to be able to speak to this topic.
That's right. And Kelli and I are actually part of a group here locally in St. Louis at CMA, who spend a bit more time working with the entrepreneurial, early stage, startup and venture capital kind of organizations and clients. And so talking to an audience like this is something we particularly enjoy. So we were excited to get the invitation. All right. So as I mentioned before, our current state is one of flux. I think, I don't know when the last hour was that I checked my phone or checked the news and it didn't talk about COVID. And I can imagine that at least for the foreseeable future, that will tend to be the case. And so that has certainly rocked almost everyone's world. Like I mentioned before, it has certainly impacted not only how we come across to others at work, but what we do and how we manage outside of work. Outside of that, 2020 has been a very interesting year, continues to be a very interesting year. There have been a number of anti-racism demonstrations. The Black Lives Matter movement has certainly been in the media very consistently after some high-profile killings of Black Americans. And you add to that even more the political divisiveness and the times that we are experiencing now. And it just seems for a lot of folks that there is nowhere to turn that is just a comfortable, relaxing space. That for many of us, we consistently continue to remain on edge. And when that happens, we feel stressed. So there's a short or brief definition here of stress, which indicates it occurs when the perceived demands of a situation outweighs one's available resources. In other words, when we feel that we don't have the capability, the tools or resources to manage what the situation is throwing at us. There's a lot of reasons why people feel stress. There are some people who are more naturally inclined or sensitive to feeling stressed. So that's more of a personality component of someone. But there are a lot of other reasons that someone might feel stressed. Past experiences, our current environment is probably increasing the stress for all of us at the moment. And resources. So resources can be, do we have the tools to manage the stress, particularly when we talk about work, but also resources in the form of support. What support from other people do we have at work and outside of work to help us manage our stress? What we know is that when those support structures are not available during trying times, that can increase someone's stress response. Not all stress is bad though, particularly again, when we look at this from a work perspective, and given mine and Kelly's background, we tend to look a lot at research into work. There tends to be a sweet spot, There tends to be a sweet spot where some stress can lead to a more optimal performance. If we're not stressed out at all, that can lead to burnout. That can lead to a lack of energy or enthusiasm to actually achieve our goals. And so some stress help us be successful. But what we tend to find, particularly now when working with leaders and employees and organizations, is there are many more who are experiencing stress that is on the downslope of that normal curve, on the right-hand side of that normal curve there. Even in the work that Kelly and I do, we look at motivators, for example, and what we have found is since the COVID pandemic in late March and early April, when some of the factors that we look at related to how people are motivated have changed dramatically. So an example of that is when we look at someone's drive and motivation to take risks, to do things that are a bit different than what they're used to put themselves out there, that tolerance has decreased substantially. In other words, people are a lot more likely right now to play it safe. And there are likely a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is, again, when we talk about work, there's a lot of flux in work right now, and some people are concerned whether or not they will have a job, especially with so many people being laid off over the last couple of months. What we also know is when our world feels like it's a bit less in our control, one of the ways that we can create control is by, being less risky in our own personal behaviors. And so it has been really interesting to see those drivers and how they've changed in people over the past couple of months. Kelli, anything you would add to the conversation around stress here?
Sorry, couldn't unmute. No, I think that captures it well.
When we talk about burnout and the neuroscience, what we know is when we are at our best, our thoughts, our reactions go through our prefrontal cortex. This is the most recent addition to our brains, right up front. The most primal part of our brains, on the other hand, if you do a cross-section of my head here and you were to look right in the middle, you would see a component of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala, among other things, controls our fight or flight tendencies. And what we know is when we're burned out or when we are stressed, our brain can short circuit a little bit. Instead of allowing ourselves the time to respond in a more thoughtful way, which happens when we respond from this part of our brain, we react quickly to something. And that happens when we don't allow our thoughts to be processed more, and it's just a quick response. And anthropologically, that makes sense, right? If a lion is coming at you, it probably isn't going to benefit you to think, well, is the lion coming after me? And why is the lion coming after me? It probably makes a bit more sense just to run away from the lion. And so that fight or flight tendency, it has some benefit. But what we find is when we're stressed, it can cause us to react in ways that can be impactful to not only the decisions we make at work, but our interactions with others. And so again, this is a bit more insight in science into how the brain works, and particularly on stress and why that can be the case. So this is the $1 million question, right? What do we do? We all know that we are under increased stress. I have hopefully made an argument that stress can have a number of potentially negative outcomes, both at work and outside of it. What we're going to share with you here today are some specific strategies that we believe you all could benefit from and can really consider using in your own life. The premise we want to talk about here, though, is that premise of you can't be a strong and effective professional if you're not taking care of yourself. It's akin to when we're at the airport or in an airplane, and many of us, I'm sure, have heard this spiel, right? If the oxygen masks come down, in the unlikely event that the oxygen masks come down, put the mask on yourself first before assisting others around you. And I think we're talking about a similar premise here. We can't be there for others if we're not there for ourselves. The ability to self-manage is an indicator of highly successful professionals. And it's not only good for you, because sometimes it can feel a bit selfish, especially for leaders to concentrate on themselves. But one thing to remember is it's not just for you, it's for those around you. If you're not at your best, if your tank is empty, you can't be there for others. And as leaders in organizations, oftentimes we are required to be there for others, regardless of whether we're having a good or bad day. And so hopefully the strategies that we share here with you not only can be helpful, but are strategies that you can model for those in your professional and even non-professional lives. So we're going to talk about 3 different components here. I'm going to start the conversation, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kelli to finish it off. So first, let's talk about what we can control. like I was mentioning before, there are always things that we can control and there are things that we can't. During times of uncertainty, really trying to identify those opportunities to control what's going on around us can be very helpful. One of the ways we can control how we are reacting or feeling is by reaching out to others. So we are social creatures. Both Kelly and I, at least I can speak for myself, I work and coach with a number of introverted, reserved, quiet people. The majority of these individuals are still finding a work from home and the really significant impact that the coronavirus has had on their ability to interact with society is very stressful. So I think a lot of people may assume that introverts don't need much social interaction. And what I would say there is they may not need as much, but it doesn't mean they don't need any. And so regardless of how you would describe yourself, the social support that we get from others is critical. And if you are feeling anxious or stressed, identifying opportunities to leverage the support you have around you, family, friends, coworkers, members of other organizations that you are a part of, leveraging these can be a very helpful strategy to manage stress.
Rob, can I pause there?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would just want to underscore this a little bit more. Rob, can you mute yourself? I think it might be echoing. Just a quick study that's really interesting that really brings this point home is a study where participants came into a lab and they gave them a moderate shock. And they compared all these different stress buffering strategies. So it was relaxation, mindfulness, journaling to reframe the stressor. And then one was holding the hand of someone you love, so holding a loved one's hand. And by far, the latter was the biggest strategy that was impactful. And if you think about it, growing up, the way in which we were able to metabolize stress was through relationships. And so this finding is just supported time after time and time after time. And so we just want to make sure, even while we are socially distancing, that we're not socially isolating, to Rob's point.
I like the distinction that I've heard, especially earlier on in the pandemic, between socially distancing and physically distancing. Although I still use the term socially distancing, I think the intent I have around that is physically distancing and not necessarily socially distancing. So I've tried to find ways to connect with people, even if it is at a distance.
Hello?
Okay. Oh,
Hello?
yeah, someone have a question?
Yeah, I do. Here's my stress relief. I just did a picture of Kelly. I just
That
did
is beautiful.
Well, I'm not done with it yet. It's just a pencil drawing. But it's
You've done that in the last 15 minutes? That's amazing.
about 5 minutes, right. 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness.
I'm just working away here. It's stress relieving, is all I'm telling you.
That's beautiful.
Oh, well, you're beautiful. What can I say?
Oh my goodness. I love it.
Yeah. Okay.
In a lot of meetings that we will have internally, there are some meetings that Kelly and I will have at CMA with the rest of our colleagues where we do offsites. And there are a number of us who, as a way to remain engaged but needing their minds to be a bit more busy, we'll bring in those adult coloring books and things like that to draw on. And so that can be a really helpful way, not only to manage stress, to your point, Arlene, but also to constantly be doing something can actually make people a bit more likely to pay attention.
Yeah. It helps.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to hand it over to Kelly here. Still me, sorry. Got one more.
Oh.
So managing the situation is another one, and this is part of what I was talking about before as well, especially at work. When we feel like the walls are coming in, when we have too many tasks, particularly now, it might have been easier for some of us before to walk down the hall or to call someone, pretty quickly who worked in a different floor or a building across the street and say, hey, I need some help here. But for a lot of us now, it feels like just another task to ask someone for help. It's a task to achieve another task. And so in these situations, it can be really helpful to try to prioritize what's important for me now. There's a great grid. It's called a number of things. I've heard it called the Eisenhower matrix, where we talk about the difference between something that is urgent and things that are important. And what we want to be doing is spending our time on those urgent and important things. Those are the things that need to get done now. And hopefully those urgent but unimportant things or are tasks that we can pay a bit less attention to, and those non-urgent and non-important things, although sometimes helpful in relieving stress, like sitting down and watching funny videos on YouTube, which is certainly a way that I manage my stress. But they don't take up too much of your time at work. And so really trying to identify what those top tier priorities are can be helpful. Are there any other strategies that those of you joining us here today have come up with that can be really helpful for you, or that you found to be helpful when it comes to managing your work, particularly if working the way you are now is different than the way you've traditionally worked?
I think, well, for me, I think it's still trying to create patterns and habits that maybe got a little disheveled when, when the day is different now than it used to be, and you don't have that focus of I'm going to leave my house and go do something, and then I'm going to debrief in my head on the commute home and come into the house with a clear head, but still making sure that you have that sort of, still have some structures, even though the days run into each other much more than they used to.
Right. We are creatures of habit, that's for sure. And that, habits are another kind of, to your point, Melissa, I love the way that you put that. They are a way to create structure, to create consistency in an inconsistent, volatile environment. Any others? All right. Let's go to our next strategy here.
All right, I will dive in. So we talked about managing your situation. We can also look at managing our thoughts and our self-talk. So what is self-talk? So Rob, you want to advance the slide a little bit? Yeah, so you can think about thinking as self-talk. So anytime we are thinking, we're engaging in an internal dialogue with ourselves. And so this is important to think about, because while we may not be able to control our situations, we can control how we perceive and we process them, right? We can't control our stressors and our challenges, but we can shape the story we're telling ourselves. And that really hugely impacts how we ultimately feel and how we ultimately behave. So if my self-talk is negative and defeating and overwhelming, then I'm going to feel a little bit more anxious and perhaps scattered or maybe paralyzed. Maybe I'll respond ineffectively. But if my self-talk is rational and empowering, I'm better able to assess my options and find the right way forward. So self-talk is one of the best tools to be thinking about how to enable it, how to shape it, especially in times of prolonged crises. The reason why this is important is that it helps you be in the driver's seat. Oh, can you go back, Rob? Helps you be in the driver's seat of your life a little bit more. To Rob's point, as you looked at that brain, when we are engaging in negative self-talk, it's churning these negative emotions that are lighting up the part of your brain that's associated with fight, flight, or freeze. And so being able to shape our self-talk in a positive way helps us tap into that higher level thinking to bring to situations. And so there are a couple of different types of self-talks you can think about. I would highly encourage, if you don't already do this occasionally, take a moment to write down your self-talk and do a little bit of a thematic analysis of what you're seeing. If you're seeing that it's highly, negative and defeating, so things like, I can't handle this, or, my team's going to lose faith in me, or this really isn't going to go very well, take a pause, label it as such, and remember that we can shift it in a healthier, adaptive way. If your thoughts are more rational, more empowering, so things like, this is a tough situation, but I have the resources to mobilize, I can lean on my social support network. Those are the types of thoughts that we're going to want to keep and repeat. And remember, it's not saying negative and positive. So it's not that the cognitive reframe is Pollyannish, it's just that it's more rational, and it's just that it's focusing more on what one can control. And just remember that oftentimes our first thought might fit within that negative category. That is just information, it's not fact, and we have control to be able to shift that thought. All right, next slide. And so we can differentiate between our thinking. There are two buckets here of worry versus problem-solving thinking. So worry is pretty negative. It's pretty open-ended, pretty repetitive, so it tends to get stuck in that same groove on the record. And it tends to have kind of this negative cast of, oh, isn't this pretty awful? Whereas problem-solving thinking is much more focused on solutions and action plans. Again, it's focusing on that higher level thinking. It's more time limited. So it might, might be thinking, this will last for 3 weeks or a few months. But the brain does a much better job when it knows that, stress has an end in sight. And it's much more cognitive than emotional. And so we can use this. So when we find that we're going into more of this unproductive anxiety, we can try to shift it into problem-solving thinking. We can listen for this type of talk in others to help them adjust. And it's not that we aren't being empathetic or that we're not listening to folks, because we want to listen to folks and hear them out. This is more when we see them in that kind of repetitive loop to try to help shift that thinking. A really great evidence-based strategy, if you are a really big worrier, is to schedule a worry appointment. So it sounds funny, but there's good science on it. So it's a time-limited worry appointment. Maybe it's 15 minutes where you just kind of let your brain run free, and you can worry as much as you want. Even better would be journaling those worries. Journaling is really helpful. And the idea is that you're giving your brain space. It wants to think about these worries. But if you're worrying outside of that time, you can label the worry as such and say, nope, I'm going to put it within this 15-minute time frame, and that way the worry, isn't infecting your whole day. That's a really helpful strategy.
Yeah.
All right.
A way I kind of like to look at it, which is in addition to what Kelly mentioned there, is, emotions are indicators, right? They help us understand what's going on internally, even if we're not as aware of it. And I think there oftentimes are individuals we surround ourselves with, or even in who we are ourselves, and I know that I'm guilty of this, particularly outside of work, who want to really skip past that emotion and go straight into action or problem solving. And to Kelly's point, for some people, if you don't have that time, that worry time, if you don't have that opportunity to actually process some of the emotions, you may jump into problem solving thinking, you might jump into action planning, but you're not ready for it yet. And so it's likely not going to solve the problem. For many people, going through that process can be helpful as long as you don't linger there.
Mm-hmm. That's the key. Yeah. What we find is with negative emotions, if we avoid them, they tend to grow because they want to be paid attention to. If we pay attention to them, we label it, we do it in an open way, but again, we do it in a more of a controlled, it's not repetitive way, they tend to soften. And so that's really the beauty of the worry time exercise. So yeah, I'm curious to hear, does anyone want to share with the folks here what helps you manage your thoughts and where you focus your mind? Does anyone want to share a tip? No? Okay.
Oh,
Well, I'll
Arlene,
share some
are
other.
you trying to, I think Arlene might be saying something, but she's on mute. You're on mute, Arlene.
Oh yeah, we can't hear you.
Okay. I was just saying, when everything gets in the way, I just want to take time out and read a chapter in a book I'm reading. That helps.
Yeah.
Or draw or paint or do something that's fun. And then you go back to it.
Yeah. That's just. Oh, go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, I mean, I'm dealing with a lot of stress with a fire I had last year. So all this insurance stuff I'm working on. And I got tired of it. Go outside and read, for a while and then come back and deal with it, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's
That can be
absolutely
easy
fabulous to just take a walk outside. In your neighborhood or wherever. I'm downtown, so I'm close to City Garden, and just a walk through there, whether there are people there or not, it's just really nice to take your brain out of your space for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mary, we're neighbors, and my favorite is to go down to the arch grounds and walk around and the trees there. There's just so much good research out there about nature and what a mindful exercise that
and
is too.
If you add Pharaoh's donuts to that walk, it's even better.
I am all in. Apple fritters, they make the best ones. It's a good stress reliever right there. Anyone else want to share? All right. Well, a couple of other tips here. So some evidence-based tips on managing your thoughts. And the first one is, the feeling a lot of us are experiencing right now is grief, among many other feelings, but just this grief that we're not able to kind of live our lives in the way we want to, and that maybe we don't have the opportunities that we once did. And what we know with grief is that it can tend to take the color out of the picture a bit. And so we have to be very intentional about putting the color back in. And so there's a great exercise called 3 Good Things, grounded in a practice of gratitude. And I know it sounds funny, but there is a lot of research out there on gratitude. It lets us know that we can really manage stress through this exercise. So it's 3 good things. The goal is for 30 days or more, but minimally 30 days, try to look for 3 good things. So maybe it's that I have enjoyed a sunset, right? Or my kid helped me load the dishwasher. It can be very small, but the goal is to train your brain to start looking for the good things and to add the color back in. And what the science suggests is that bad news and negative things are pretty sticky. Good news and positive thoughts are pretty slippery. So we have a lot of real estate in our brains devoted to the negative. So the 3 good things is a great way to train ourselves. So let's keep going. We've talked about situation. We've talked about managing our thoughts and self-talk. And then lastly, managing our response. So when we think about our behavior, it can fall in these 2 buckets of respond and react. So react is very based on feelings, right? We act and then we process afterward. It's very adaptive in an emergency or dangerous situation. To Rob's point, right? If a lion is chasing you, it's pretty adaptive that we don't have to process whether or not to run. We just run and then we'll think about it afterwards. But it's not is helpful for long-term planning and thinking. And in fact, if we are continuously wearing that emergency hat, it can really wear on us and can really, as we're running that pretty adrenaline-fueled race, be pretty draining. And so, again, we're wanting to help you protect your precious resources right now and build those energy stores. So it's much better to think about how can I respond rather than react. Response is more about a cognitive and thoughtful response. We're thinking first, we're making decisions, and then we're acting. It's much more about a conscious choice, and it's much more about better for the long term. So how do we do this? I mean, if you think back to what Rob shared at the beginning about our situation, remembering to tap into those resources, right? To lean on your social support network, to be thinking about delegating, for example, to manage your priorities. So you just have a bigger pool of resources to lean on, because it's very easy to be in that react emergency mode when we're feeling pretty drained. And so if you want to go to the next slide, Rob. There's a great quote here that wraps this up from Viktor Frankl. Some of you maybe have read his book called Man's Search for Meaning, but he was an Austrian psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. And his quote here is, "Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." So it's that idea that when we're triggered, when there's a stimulus, we do have the power to kind of pause and intentionally choose our response. And again, we've talked here about resources and building up those resources. I highly recommend creating a self-care plan if you don't already have one, as a way to help us fill up our tanks. And just kind of track it, helpful to share it with someone, to hold you accountable. The categories here, so breathing, this is a really helpful one for responding rather than reacting in the moment. Just a few deep breaths help calm a pretty, nervous, jittery nervous system. And then, thinking about what we're eating and how much we're exercising. Exercise has been found, especially when it's vigorous, 3 days at least a week, to be as effective as antidepressants. So if you're under an immense amount of stress, get the exercise in. Sleep, that one can sometimes go when we're stressed, and that's a double whammy because we have a hard time regulating our emotions when we're not getting sleep. So really trying to aim for an average of 8 hours a night when you can. And then lastly, we've talked about this one, but can't emphasize enough, social support, making sure you're not isolating and that you're leaning on that network.
As a parent of a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old, I've been really leveraging the breathing recently. It's worked most of the time. I can't say it's worked all the time, but the breathing is helpful.
How about the sleep category, Rob?
That's a bit less consistent, so I try to emphasize the ones that I have more control over.
Right. Play to your strengths. So last slide before we'll go to some questions. So when we are stressed, what we find is that our focus tends to narrow. And so it can be really helpful to try to take a 20,000-foot view. Hopefully some of the strategies Rob and I shared are helpful to that end, to try to pull out of the here and now. But asking yourself questions like, let's say it's a year from now, hopefully we're beyond the crisis. What do I hope my organization looks like? Where do I hope I am as a person? And how can I take actions right now that are going to get me closer to that end goal? And then there's another concept I just wanted to share quickly. Many of us have probably heard of post-traumatic stress. There's also in the research this concept of post-traumatic growth, which is this idea that, we all wish we weren't in the situation. It's immensely challenging. But in fact, that given that it happened, many people on the other side of challenges are going to experience a level of growth. So it might be a deeper sense of personal strength and resiliency, maybe a deeper sense of purpose, maybe it's deeper relationships. But just know that is a finding that's pretty strong out there in the research, and is a helpful one to remind yourself of on especially tough days. So with that, Rob and I will open it up. If anyone has questions they want to ask, we're happy to chat.
I have a question, that quote about the space between stimulus and response. Sometimes it's not a space. I had a kid who was born angry and things would piss her off. And we discovered that she had no control over the fact that stuff pissed her off, but she had control over how long she stayed pissed off. So sometimes stuff will just stress you. So just notice it and decide how long you're going to let it keep you stressed.
Right. I think that's key, that the stressor is inevitable often. We're going to experience stressors, but it's more our response that we have control over. I think that's key, and that's where we get the space between the stimulus and the response.
Do you have any, thank you very much, by the way, for hosting this session. It was, of course, very timely and very helpful, both. Do you have any tips for when you see your friends or your family members or coworkers, you know, kind of feeling very stressed and not, you know, you just don't want to say, wow, you're really stressed out, but, you know, how to help them kind of make some of the mental shifts without irritating them more than they might already be irritated?
This is my boss speaking. What are you saying, ML? What do you?
I'm not talking about you, Melissa.
Well, this is a great backdoor way to let someone know that, hey, you know, Melissa, you're experiencing some issues, and we're gonna air it out here.
Better she's talking about me,
Oh,
Melissa.
there's Connie.
This is just
So
really the
funny.
I-10 therapy session. We didn't. No, but go ahead. Go ahead, Bob. You're starting to answer ML's question.
Oh, no, I'll jump in and start by saying, you know, like anything else, understanding your relationship with someone is probably the first thing to think about. And so at work, you know, there's kind of some strengths and some, you know, things to watch out for if you are a manager talking to an employee about this. So, you know, there might be more of a natural opportunity for you to have those conversations, but really putting on your kind of listening ear, saying, this is what I'm noticing. Am I off base? Is something going on? How can I support you? Ultimately, that asking of how I can support you is probably the best question to ask. And using your judgment around, you know, are you seeing it right now? And is this person dealing with something today? And is that reaction similar a couple days from when you first saw it? So, you know, oftentimes we might not be in the best space to hear feedback about how we're behaving in the moment. Yeah, you don't want to let it go on for days and days, but, you know, try to give that person the benefit of the doubt, and then having those conversations by asking questions about how you can support them can be helpful. I think a similar strategy can work outside of work. So if you're talking to a family member, a significant other, asking those questions and letting them know what's happening can be really helpful. I know that certainly conversations that happen in my household when my wife or I kind of notice something in each other, oftentimes we're waiting a bit less long to have those conversations than we would at work. But what you don't want to do is come across as accusatory or aggressive or say, I don't like that you're doing this. It's likely not about you, so don't try to make it. Kelly, what would you add there?
Yeah, I would just add, in situations like that, when the feelings feel pretty raw and intense, I like the analogy about thinking about it like a balloon, and that you're going to want to kind of let the air out of the balloon, especially if it's really intense. And it's going to be a judgment call about kind of how long you wait while you let the balloon deflate. But if we find we kind of give the feedback, or we move to the problem solving before the balloon is deflated, right, they're not going to hear our feedback and our thoughts. So giving them some space, showing empathy and kind of that unconditional positive regard, and then thinking about, okay, how do we actively cope with that? How do we move out of the worry thinking if you find that it's pretty repetitive, and to try to move into some problem solving. But again, to Rob's point, making sure you're not going there too quickly.
What other questions?
I heard 30%, divorces are up 30%. I mean, I'm not married, but that's what I heard on someone said. Divorces are up because they have to share space too much.
Could be.
Too much overload, well, whatever.
That's right. When
Yeah.
there's fewer outlets sometimes with when everything else is closed down and you're told not to get too close to people outside of your bubble. So I've heard
Well,
something similar there, Arlene.
Yeah, I would think if you had a lot in common, at least playing games together, doing something, it wouldn't be so bad. If you have a lot in common, if you don't, it's going to be a problem, I guess.
Nope.
So
So yes,
I kind of have a question.
yeah, as you say, we just got a couple minutes. Go ahead, Connie,
yeah.
sorry.
That's okay. No, so for like an organization, I know you're saying, you know, if there's support there to give employees for stress related issues. So how is a good way to get that into the hands of the people, employees, and how do you make them feel comfortable using those resources?
You want to start, Kelly?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say just making sure that what we find, at least in organizations, is that there's usually a want for this kind of stuff. So we usually find, at least at a lower level, right? Within leaders, sometimes we've kind of got to do the work of helping them understand what's the ROI and really why does this pay off. But for employees, what we find is folks have natural struggles and challenges, and they're looking for resources for how to deal with stress. And so we tend to find that socializing it and disseminating it is really helpful. Where I would start if I was a leader is, you know, in my individual relationship with that individual and one-on-ones, again, checking in with them to see how they're doing, especially right now, meeting folks where they are and trying to, again, show a high level of empathy to see what is the degree to which they're feeling challenged, and then to give them resources accordingly. The model I like to use, it's a really easy model to remember within organizational psychology about stress, is the control, demand, social support model. And so the three biggest predictors of stress. And so when employees come to you, trying to think about how do I reduce their level of demand, thinking about what's on their plate, how do I help them increase a sense of control? For example, right now, there's such a blur between home and work-life boundaries. So how can I help them, for example, have better start and break and end times, right? Are you taking enough breaks? Are you mentally and physically putting work down? So to help them gain a sense of control. And then lastly, social support. So do they feel like they have strong relationships at work? And if not, can I be a conduit for helping folks connect? Especially right now where individuals are remote, what we're finding is that organic communication that used to happen now needs to happen much more intentionally. So might we want to get them with a peer or someone else to compare notes about challenges. So that's a really helpful mental model, control or demand control, social support that I would use in a one-on-one situation. We could talk about this forever. Rob, what would you add?
The only addition there I have is, you know, as a leader, you know, remember that you're on stage. People at work will take cues from you. And so, and you've seen Kelly and I even do it a little bit here today, right? Sharing just a little bit about your struggles in a way that is genuine to who you are. You don't have to share everything that's going on, but starting the conversation may allow others to feel a bit more comfortable to share what's going on with them. If they don't see it coming from you, they may be less likely to think it's safe to share what's going on.
Mhm.
Yep. So
Yeah.
we're up against time. I wish we could talk even more about this, but yes, I think, Rob, just to add to what you just said, not only sharing, but modeling the self-care practices that you guys have gone through for us today, I think can definitely, as founders are starting to build their teams and creating a corporate culture that is important and has the self-care priority woven through it, is, you know, an important thing to do from the beginning. So
Right.
I really appreciate you guys coming and joining us today and sharing not only strategies, but why is it important and why does it matter? Because I think a lot of times we can go, yeah, that sounds like I should be meditating more. Yes, but why? And, you know, what can it actually do for my brain and for my team and for myself and for the people around me? I think if people had additional questions, both Rob had put both Kelly and his emails in the chat. You know, also you can reach out to me and we can connect you with them as well. But just to be mindful of those coming into the Zoom room after us here at Venture Cafe, I want to just thank our speakers again, and thank you to everybody for joining us for another Second Thursday programming. And we will see you back here next month on the second Thursday. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
See ya.
Thanks everyone for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.